As of early December 2025, Donald Trump is serving his second current term as President of the United States, having returned to office in January as the 47th president. Vladimir Putin remains president of Russia, having been sworn in for a fifth term in May 2024 and continuing to direct Russia's war in Ukraine. Both men met again this year at a high-stakes summit in Anchorage, Alaska, billed as an effort to end the war in Ukraine, but shadowed by questions about power, leverage, and money. What follows is a 2,500-word journalist-style voiceover script built around that central question: Trump's secret business deals with Putin, profit over peace. Important real-world statements are kept verbatim in bold quotes with the speaker's name. The cameras flash white against the Alaskan twilight as two motorcades roll through the gates of a U.S. military base. On one side, the stars and stripes flutter in the cold wind. On the other, the tricolour of Russia. Inside a secure conference hall at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, the world's attention narrows to a single room and two men who have defined an era of confrontation and uneasy cooperation. At the head of one table sits President Donald Trump, the only American leader in history to return to the White House after losing a previous election, and the first to govern while openly running a sprawling business empire and a publicly traded media company from the Oval Office. Across from him sits President Vladimir Putin, Russia's dominant figure for a quarter of a century, the architect of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the subject of an international criminal court arrest warrant over alleged war crimes. Officially, the agenda in Alaska is peace, the future of Ukraine, sanctions, security guarantees. Unofficially, the questions that swirl around this summit are far more uncomfortable questions about money, influence, and the blurred line between national interest and private profit. Because whenever Trump and Putin sit down together, one suspicion always creeps back. Are these negotiations purely about ending a war, or are they also about business? To understand why those suspicions are so persistent, you have to start with the man in the White House today. Trump returned to office in January 2025 as the 47th president, older, more combative, and less constrained by the norms that shaped his first term. Ethics experts and watchdogs have described his second presidency as one with fewer guardrails than his first, particularly around conflicts of interest. Unlike previous presidents, he has not put his assets into a blind trust. Instead, he continues to benefit from a network of branded properties, licensing deals, and now a media and tech company whose stock price has surged and crashed on the back of his political fortunes. Investigations and financial disclosures show that since taking office again, Trump has made hundreds of investment transactions worth more than $100 million, including in companies directly affected by his own policies. He has promoted and profited from cryptocurrency tokens linked to his name, and he has openly used tariffs and regulatory pressure as negotiating tools with foreign governments and corporations. In one cabinet meeting this week, he lashed out at a word that had once been central to his own campaign messaging. Trump said the word affordability was a Democrat scam. It was a small line in a long meeting, but a revealing one. The president, who brands himself as a champion of ordinary Americans, is also a businessman navigating global markets, investments, and branding opportunities at the very top of government. For critics, that dual identity president and profit seeker lies at the heart of the concern. When Trump sits down with a foreign leader, is he thinking first about the national interest or about the balance sheet? On the other side of the Alaska table, Vladimir Putin faces his own but very different set of pressures. Russia's war in Ukraine has dragged on for nearly 3 years, with enormous human and economic costs. Western sanctions have hit Russian banks, energy companies, and oligarchs. Yet Russia's economy has adapted, redirecting trade to Asia, leaning on oil exports and deepening partnerships with countries like China, India, Iran, and North Korea. It is a wartime economy welded to a political system that revolves around a single man. Putin has been either president or prime minister of Russia since the last days of the 20th century. Analysts describe him as the de facto leader of Russia for a quarter century, presiding over a state where political power and economic privilege are tightly intertwined. When he speaks about the war, he does so in stark transactional terms. In a recent interview, he laid out Russia's aims in eastern Ukraine with brutal clarity. Putin said Russia would take all of Ukraine's Donbas region militarily or otherwise. That phrase, militarily or otherwise, hangs over every negotiation. It says, in effect, that peace is not a moral goal but a tactic, that the method, whether bombs or diplomacy, is less important than the result. And it is that mindset that fuels another fear, that for Putin, any peace deal with the United States is not just about territory, but about unlocking new channels of influence and economic relief, possibly through quiet understandings with those who control the levers of Western power, including the American president. So what exactly do we know about business interests on each side as these two leaders push for a deal? On the Russian side, the picture is familiar: state-linked energy giants, metals and mining companies, and banks seeking loopholes in sanctions regimes. Russia has found willing buyers for its oil and gas in Asia, and it has deepened strategic economic partnerships with countries like Iran, signing a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership that covers energy, defense, and finance. On the American side, the picture is more unusual, because it is not just about corporate lobbyists or campaign donors. It is about the president's own businesses. Trump's companies have long sought international projects, from hotels and towers to licensing deals, even when he was a private citizen. During his first term, his refusal to fully divest raised questions about whether foreign governments could curry favor by spending money at his properties. Those questions have only intensified in his second term as he promotes a media company, crypto ventures, and merchandise lines while setting US policy. One major newspaper investigation this year described secret deals, foreign investments, and presidential policy changes surrounding a Trump-aligned crypto firm, highlighting potential overlaps between the president's private business interests and his public decisions. Another analysis detailed how companies facing tariffs or regulatory pressure often appeared to win relief after making donations or concessions that aligned with Trump's political goals. Ethics lawyers have warned that such patterns create leverage points, opportunities for foreign actors to see US policy not as a fixed stance, but as something that can be influenced through economic ties to the president's world. That is the context in which the Alaska summit takes place. A wartime Russia hungry for sanctions relief and access to Western capital, and an American president whose business portfolio thrives in a global environment where his name, his access, and his decisions all have a price. Now layer on the stakes of the summit itself. The 2025 Russia-United States summit in Alaska was framed as a turning point. After months of indirect talks in Saudi Arabia between the US, Secretary of State and Russia's Foreign Minister, Trump and Putin finally sat down in person. The stated goal: to move toward an agreement that would halt major combat operations in Ukraine, freeze territorial lines, and open the door to a new security architecture in Europe. For Trump, success could mean a claim to have done what his predecessors could not, ending the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II. For Putin, success could mean a de facto recognition of Russian gains on the ground, along with a gradual easing of sanctions that have isolated Russia from Western finance and technology. But success for whom? For which interests? Behind closed doors, negotiators discuss not only ceasefire lines and demilitarized zones, but also energy corridors, transit rights, and future investment frameworks. Any serious peace plan for Ukraine necessarily involves questions about pipelines, ports, and the reconstruction contracts that will shape post-war Europe. Those are not abstract details. They are business opportunities worth tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. In that environment, the concern is not simply that Trump and Putin might walk away with a handshake and a vague statement. The concern is that they might walk away with understandings that the public never fully sees, understandings that blur the line between geopolitics and personal gain. What might profit over peace actually look like in practice? It might look like sanctions relief targeted in ways that favor companies with quiet connections to Kremlin-aligned oligarchs, while leaving Ukrainian firms at a disadvantage in reconstruction. It might look like US tariff policies or export control decisions that are softened for certain intermediaries who can route goods into Russia, even as public rhetoric remains tough. On the American side, it might look like foreign state-linked funds taking positions in companies tied to the Trump brand or in counterparties that stand to gain from his regulatory decisions while negotiations with Russia proceed on a parallel track. It might look like deal-making around oil, gas and rare earth minerals that assigns lucrative concessions to entities that understand how to navigate both Moscow and Mar-a-Lago. None of this requires a single signed piece of paper labelled secret deal. It relies instead on a web of incentives, expectations and quiet understandings, what diplomats sometimes call complementary arrangements. And it takes place in a world where transparency has eroded. Trump has rolled back ethics rules put in place after previous corruption scandals, weakened internal watchdogs and overseen the downsizing of public corruption units at the Justice Department and the FBI. Trump used mass firing to remove independent inspectors general at a series of agencies, one account noted earlier this year, describing how oversight mechanisms were stripped down just as his administration expanded its power over business and trade. When the referees are pushed off the field, it becomes much harder to know where foreign policy ends and private negotiation begins. For Putin, the incentive to test those boundaries is obvious. Russia's economy is under strain. While it has avoided collapse, it faces long-term challenges from sanctions, a shrinking labour force, and the enormous cost of sustaining a war machine. Yet Moscow has also shown a remarkable ability to exploit loopholes, routing energy through third countries, using shadow fleets of tankers, and striking deals with partners who are willing to defy Western pressure. At the same time, Putin has cultivated what some analysts call a sanctions-resistant elite business figures who can operate through offshore networks and opaque financial instruments. For such an elite, a US administration that treats tariffs, sanctions, and access to American markets as bargaining chips rather than fixed rules is a tempting target. So when Putin sits across from Trump in Alaska, he is not just negotiating with a head of state, he is negotiating with someone who understands the language of leverage, loans and licensing. In that world, peace can easily become just another asset to be traded. For Trump, the incentives are more complex. On one level, a grand peace deal with Russia would be a legacy-defining achievement. He has repeatedly promised that he could end the war in Ukraine faster and more effectively than his predecessors, casting himself as a deal-maker capable of taming even Putin. On another level, a peace framework that reopens certain channels of trade could create new economic opportunities for companies that understand where the new lines will be drawn. That includes American firms, European intermediaries, and potentially entities tied to the president's own network. Trump has already demonstrated a willingness to blur personal and official branding. The recent decision to rename the U.S. Institute of Peace's building in Washington as the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace was announced just days before a major peace deal signing, sparking both praise and outrage. The White House said the renaming honoured Trump's efforts in ending multiple wars, even as critics argued that the move undermined the institution's independence and symbolised the merging of public diplomacy with personal brand building. In other words, even peace itself is being rebranded in Trump's name and in some cases marketed as part of a broader political and commercial project. So where does that leave the central question? Are there secret business deals between Trump and Putin? Here, the answer has to be careful and precise. There is no public documented proof of a formal written business contract between Trump and Putin personally over the current peace process. To state otherwise would be to cross the line from investigation into speculation. What we do have, however, is a pattern. A Russian president who has fused political control with a network of loyal business figures and who sees economic leverage as a tool of statecraft. An American president who has repeatedly benefited from blurring the boundaries between his public office and his private ventures, who has rolled back ethics rules and whose financial interests remain deeply entangled with global markets. A war whose end will be shaped not only by where armies stand, but by who controls ports, pipelines and contracts, and who gets invited into the room when those decisions are made. In that context, secret deals are less about a single dramatic revelation and more about a continuous risk, the risk that decisions about peace, territory, and human lives are being influenced, even indirectly, by private financial incentives that voters and citizens never see. Outside the conference hall in Alaska, Ukrainian soldiers still face Russian artillery across a torn front line. In eastern Ukraine, families live under occupation or under fire, knowing that any peace reached in distant rooms may freeze their reality in place. In Europe, governments debate how far to go in using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. And on financial markets from New York to Dubai, investors quietly adjust their bets, tracking every hint from Washington and Moscow about the direction of sanctions, tariffs, and new economic corridors. Inside the room, the two presidents know all of this. They know the human cost of continued war. They know the value of those future pipelines and contracts. They know how a single phrase in a ceasefire text can redirect billions of dollars toward one set of companies and away from another. The real question then is not whether a secret contract exists, but which set of incentives will prevail. Will Trump choose a path that maximizes transparency, pushes for robust, independent monitoring, and ensures that any economic benefits are tied to genuine compliance and justice for Ukraine? Or will he accept a patchwork peace that locks in Russia's gains, quietly eases pressure on Kremlin-linked firms, and creates new channels where business interests can thrive in the shadows? Will Putin see peace as a genuine step away from aggression, or as another instrument, militarily or otherwise, to secure his aims at lower cost? And will the rest of the world insist on seeing the full picture, on demanding disclosures, oversight, and accountability, or will it settle for photo ops and slogans while the real deals are struck off camera? As the summit breaks for the evening, aides gather the briefing folders, motorcades line up once again, and the presidents disappear into their respective secure suites. Outside, the Alaskan night stretches clear and cold, indifferent to the weight of what is being discussed behind closed doors. The world will hear about progress, about constructive talks, about open channels. There may even, in time, be a framework, a signing ceremony, another building renamed, or another medal awarded. But the core dilemma will remain. In an age where presidents are brands and wars are also markets, can peace ever be truly separated from profit? That is the unresolved question hanging over every handshake between Trump and Putin. And until the financial interests surrounding them are fully understood and transparently regulated, the suspicion will linger that somewhere just out of sight, the most important deals are not about ending the war, but about who gets paid when it ends.